Welcome to another powerful session on Avoidant Decoded. If you truly want to understand the mind of an avoidant and finally reclaim your emotional power, consider becoming a member of this channel and start your journey toward clarity, strength, and self-respect. There comes a point in almost every connection with an avoidant person where something inside you quietly breaks. Not because your feelings fade, but because you grow tired of always reaching for someone who keeps stepping back. You were the one starting conversations, explaining your emotions, trying to clear misunderstandings, and constantly proving your worth. Yet somehow, the more you gave, the more distant they seemed to become. What most people don't understand is that avoidant individuals are not secretly wishing someone would try harder or chase them endlessly. Their distance is rarely about your love being too much. More often, closeness activates fears they don't fully understand themselves. Fear of losing independence, fear of relying on someone emotionally, fear of disappointing someone they care about, and fear of being fully seen and vulnerable. And the moment you stop chasing, something begins to change. Not because you're trying to punish them or play games, but because your energy is no longer constantly available. For the first time, they experience your absence instead of your effort. The comfort they once had, knowing you would always reach out, suddenly disappears. And that silence can affect them more deeply than most people realize. The biggest misunderstanding is thinking the goal is to make them hurt or regret losing you. That's not where the real shift happens. The real transformation begins when you stop neglecting yourself just to keep someone else close. You stop pouring your energy into someone who keeps pulling away, and that shift changes your entire presence. You become calmer, more grounded, more emotionally stable. And interestingly, that version of you often feels safer to an avoidant than the anxious version that constantly needed reassurance. Avoidants don't respond well to pressure. They don't open up to accusations, emotional ultimatums, or desperate attempts to force connection. When you say things like, "Why are you ignoring me?" or "After everything I've done," it creates emotional weight that their system wants to escape from. But when you come from a place of calm confidence, it lands differently. Saying something like, "I care about you, but I'm not going to chase someone who isn't choosing me," carries strength without pressure. There's no desperation in it, no attempt to control them, just self-respect. Avoidants are highly sensitive to emotional intensity. They often expect people to react strongly when they create distance. They anticipate panic, clinginess, or emotional pursuit. But when you respond with calmness and dignity instead, it disrupts their expectations. It introduces something unfamiliar. They begin to consider that they might actually lose someone who truly understood them. Deep down, avoidants often want reassurance, but without feeling trapped. They desire connection, but also emotional space. They long for a kind of love that says, "I care about you deeply, but I'm still whole on my own." That energy changes everything. The moment you stop chasing, you stop communicating fear. And when fear is gone, your value becomes clearer. Suddenly they start to notice the difference. Your absence feels heavier. Your silence carries more weight than all the conversations before. That's often when their emotional walls begin to soften, not because you manipulated them, but because you finally chose yourself. One of the strongest things you can do is stop begging for love and start rebuilding your own emotional foundation. You stop trying to convince someone to stay. You stop lowering your standards just to keep a connection alive. You stop sacrificing your peace for something that keeps draining you. And all the energy you once used chasing them starts building your confidence instead. That's real power. Not forcing someone to love you, but having enough self-respect to walk away from what keeps hurting you. And ironically, that's often when an avoidant begins to see your value more clearly. Not when you were trying to prove yourself, but when your silence carried peace instead of fear. Because eventually, your energy shifts. It no longer says, "Please choose me." It starts saying, "I choose myself too." And that changes everything. Avoidant dynamics are confusing for both sides. When things start to feel deeper, you may experience that as connection and safety, but they may experience it as pressure, expectation, or loss of control. That's why chasing rarely works the way people hope it will. When you send more messages, ask for reassurance, or try harder to fix things, your intention may come from love. But to an avoidant, that intensity can feel overwhelming. Instead of feeling safe, they feel pressure building around them. So while you move closer, they instinctively move away to regain space. This creates a painful cycle. The more one person pursues, the more the other withdraws. And the more distance there is, the stronger the urge becomes to chase. What makes it even harder is that avoidants rarely explain what they're feeling. Instead of saying they're overwhelmed, they become quiet, inconsistent, or emotionally distant. To you, it feels like rejection. To them, it feels like self-protection. And when you finally stop chasing, the entire emotional dynamic shifts. At first, they may even feel relief because the pressure is gone. Their system calms down. But over time, something deeper starts to happen. The energy they were used to receiving is no longer there. The constant reassurance, the attention, the emotional effort, it's missing. And in that absence, they begin to feel something they didn't feel before. The space you gave them becomes a mirror. And sometimes, for the first time, they start to recognize what your presence actually meant. The energy they once received from you suddenly disappears. No more constant messages, no more emotional chasing, no more reassurance always waiting for them. And when something that familiar fades away, attention naturally turns toward what's missing. That's why silence becomes so powerful. When you were always reaching out, your presence became predictable. They knew you would come back, fix things, and keep the connection alive. But when you pull your energy back and return to yourself, your absence stands out in a way your effort never did. The moment you stop chasing an avoidant, a shift begins that most people don't fully understand. Before, everything followed a pattern. They expected you to initiate, to explain, to hold things together, no matter how far they pulled away. Your effort became part of the relationship's rhythm, and because it was always there, they learned how to handle it without truly feeling its weight. But when you stop, that pattern breaks completely. Suddenly you become unpredictable in a way they didn't prepare for, and unpredictability creates space in the mind. In that space, thoughts begin to form without the usual pressure that made them shut down. They start noticing the silence, the missing messages, the reactions that never came. They notice the version of you that no longer revolves around maintaining the connection. At first, their thoughts may stay on the surface. They might wonder if you've lost interest or if something has changed. But underneath that, something deeper starts happening. For the first time, they realize your emotional presence is no longer guaranteed, and that realization impacts them more than people expect. Avoidants are very sensitive when it comes to their sense of independence. When someone is always chasing them, they subconsciously feel in control of the distance. They believe they can pull away whenever they want and still have the other person there waiting. But when you stop compensating for their withdrawal, that safety net disappears. Now the distance feels different. It no longer feels like space they chose. It begins to feel like separation they may not fully control. And that difference changes everything. When you were always pursuing, their actions didn't carry real consequences because you kept the connection alive on your own. But once you step back, they are left alone with the reality of their choices. For the first time, their distance creates emptiness instead of relief. And that's where the emotional shift begins. Not in loud or dramatic ways, but quietly over time. Your absence starts showing up in unexpected moments, during silence, in the middle of their day, in the spaces where your energy used to exist. In those moments, their mind starts reassessing what your presence actually meant. Not because you're forcing them to notice you, but because you've stopped forcing anything at all. And that contrast becomes powerful. What avoidants truly respond to is not intensity or constant reassurance. In fact, too much emotional pursuit often overwhelms them, even if it comes from genuine love. What they actually need is something much more rare: connection without pressure. At their core, avoidants live with an inner conflict. One part of them wants closeness deeply, while another part fears what that closeness might demand. They're not as emotionally distant as people assume. Many of them feel things very deeply. The challenge is that intimacy can start to feel like expectation, responsibility, or a loss of freedom. So when someone approaches them with urgency, even with good intentions, their system can interpret it as pressure instead of safety. That's why they often want emotional security without feeling trapped. They want connection that still gives them space to breathe. They are naturally drawn to people who can love deeply without falling apart the moment distance appears. And this is exactly where everything changes when you stop chasing. You begin to represent something different emotionally. Instead of being another source of pressure, you become a source of stability. You're no longer trying to force closeness, convince them to stay, or panic when they pull away. And to an avoidant, that feels surprisingly safe. Dependence feels heavy to them, but steadiness feels calming. Many avoidants have experienced relationships where closeness quickly turned into emotional overwhelm. If they needed space, it led to conflict. If they pulled away, they were chased harder. If they struggled emotionally, the situation escalated into pressure and confrontation. Over time, they begin associating intimacy with exhaustion. So when they encounter someone who stays grounded instead of reactive, something inside them begins to soften. The pressure they expect simply isn't there anymore, and in its place, they feel a calm presence. That calmness is what reaches them, not something loud or dramatic, but something steady and safe. For perhaps the first time, they experience a connection that doesn't demand constant proof, urgency, or immediate emotional response. And because of that, they start seeing you differently. not as someone trying to pull them closer all the time, but as someone who is secure within themselves. That creates a different kind of respect. Avoidants often respect emotional strength more than emotional pursuit. When they see that your identity doesn't collapse just because they created distance, they begin associating you with stability rather than pressure. And stability is something they can slowly move toward without feeling trapped. This is also why calm confidence matters so much when communicating with them. It's not just about the words you say, but the energy behind them. Avoidants are very sensitive to urgency, emotional intensity, and unspoken pressure. Even kind and loving words can feel overwhelming if they carry desperation underneath. When your energy becomes calm, steady, and emotionally grounded, their defenses start to lower on their own. This kind of confidence isn't about pretending you don't care. It's about expressing how you feel without attaching fear or urgency to the outcome. You speak your truth honestly, but you don't try to force a reaction or control how they respond. Instead of chasing reassurance, you simply say what you feel and allow space for them to meet you where they are. To an avoidant, this feels completely different. It doesn't corner them or make them feel trapped. It doesn't demand immediate emotional closeness. It gives them room to breathe. And within that space, something important begins to happen. Their nervous system no longer feels under pressure, so they don't feel the need to pull away right away. They can actually sit with the connection instead of escaping it. Your words start to land differently because they're no longer filled with tension or desperation. There's calmness in them, self-respect in them, and a sense of inner peace. That kind of energy is far more impactful than chasing ever could be. Steadiness is something avoidants rarely experience, especially in emotionally intense situations. Most interactions quickly turn reactive the moment distance appears. That's why calm confidence stands out so much. It quietly communicates, "You're safe here. Nothing is being demanded from you." For someone whose system is always preparing for emotional pressure, that kind of energy feels different right away. Not because it's loud or dramatic, but because it feels peaceful enough to stay connected to. Silence also takes on a completely different meaning in these dynamics. For most people, silence feels uncomfortable, like rejection or abandonment. So the natural reaction is to close the gap immediately by sending another message, explaining more, or trying to fix things. But with an avoidant, silence is not empty. Silence carries meaning. When you constantly chase someone, your presence becomes expected. Even if they pull away, they assume you'll come back and restore the connection. Your effort keeps everything going no matter how distant they become. But when you stop chasing, that structure falls apart. Now the connection isn't being carried by you alone anymore. There's no constant reassurance that you'll always close the distance. And that's when silence begins to hold emotional weight. At first, many avoidants feel relief instead of anxiety. The emotional intensity is gone. There are no heavy conversations, no feeling of having to manage someone else's emotions. Their system relaxes because the pressure fades. But over time, their attention shifts to what's no longer there. The human mind notices when patterns break. When someone who was always present suddenly becomes quiet, it stands out. Questions begin to form. Why did things change? Why does this silence feel different? Why is their absence noticeable now? That's where silence becomes powerful. Not because it demands anything, but because it creates space for reflection without interference. When you were constantly pursuing them, their focus stayed on handling the emotional intensity. But when that intensity disappears, they're left alone with their own thoughts about the connection. Without pressure clouding their perception, their thoughts begin to surface naturally. The connection no longer feels guaranteed. Your energy is no longer always there in the background. For the first time, they experience what your absence actually feels like instead of relying on the familiarity of your effort. Silence also shifts the sense of control. Before, they controlled the pace. They could step back whenever they wanted and still feel confident the connection would remain because you kept it alive. But when you stop chasing, that certainty disappears. Now things feel less predictable, and unpredictability creates focus. What makes silence so impactful is that it doesn't trigger their defenses the way emotional pressure does. It doesn't force them into anything. It simply allows space for them to process the connection without feeling threatened. Over time, your absence changes how they experience you emotionally. You're no longer someone who is always available no matter how inconsistent things become. Your energy now carries boundaries, distance, and self-respect. But the most important shift isn't happening inside them. It's happening inside you. Reclaiming your strength after an emotionally draining connection isn't about becoming cold or detached. It's about coming back to yourself after spending too much time revolving around someone else's inconsistency. When you're stuck in chasing, your emotional state becomes tied to their behavior. A reply brings relief. Silence feels like rejection. Their attention starts controlling how you feel. Over time, that disconnects you from yourself. But the moment you stop letting someone else's inconsistency define your worth, your power begins to return. You stop seeing their distance as proof that you're not enough. You begin to understand that their withdrawal often comes from their own patterns and fears, not your value. That realization changes everything. You stop trying to earn consistency by giving more and more. You stop proving your worth through endless patience. You stop negotiating your value through emotional effort. Instead, you start noticing patterns without losing yourself in them, and that's where real healing begins. Your focus slowly shifts back to your own life. The energy you once spent overthinking, analyzing, and waiting becomes available again. When that energy is redirected toward growth, purpose, discipline, creativity, and self-respect, something powerful happens. You start becoming yourself again, because chasing doesn't just drain you emotionally, it weakens your identity. It turns you reactive instead of intentional. It makes you wait instead of build. Your world starts revolving around someone else's availability. Taking your power back reverses all of that. You stop depending emotionally on someone else's inconsistency and reconnect with your own direction. A big part of this shift is emotional discipline, not suppressing how you feel and not pretending you don't care, but learning to experience emotions without reacting impulsively. When the urge to chase or seek reassurance shows up, you pause instead of acting immediately. And in that pause, your self-control grows stronger. That's where your power rebuilds. Over time, your standards begin to change. You realize peace feels better than emotional chaos. Consistency becomes more valuable than intensity. You stop romanticizing confusion and start appreciating clarity. You stop overextending yourself for people who can't meet you emotionally. You stop forcing conversations that cost you your self-respect. You stop shrinking yourself just to keep a connection alive. And ironically, this grounded version of you becomes more magnetic, not because you're trying to attract anyone, but because your energy is no longer scattered. Your presence becomes calm. Your boundaries become clear. Your choices become intentional. At the center of all of this is one truth people often learn the hard way. Chasing doesn't create healthy love, it creates imbalance. The harder you try to secure connection through pressure, over-explaining, or constant pursuit, the more you hand your self-worth to someone whose availability is unstable. That's why the real turning point is never about changing the avoidant. It's about ending the pattern that pulls you away from your own peace. When you stop chasing, it becomes more than just a behavior change. It becomes a shift in who you are. You stop reacting to everything and start observing clearly. You stop fearing silence and start understanding what silence reveals. Because silence removes illusion. It shows what's left when effort is no longer carrying the connection. And even though that truth can feel uncomfortable, it brings clarity. Clarity about what you truly need, what you should no longer chase, and what kind of love actually feels stable. At that point, whether they come back or not, stops being the center of your world. Your peace becomes the center. Your growth becomes the center. Your emotional stability becomes the center. You're no longer waiting to be chosen. You choose yourself first. In the end, the real shift begins the moment you stop chasing someone who keeps pulling away and start reconnecting with yourself. Avoidant dynamics don't change through pressure or desperation. They shift when self-respect, emotional balance, and calm confidence replace fear and over-attachment. The moment you stop sacrificing your peace for someone else's inconsistency, you take your power back. And regardless of whether they return or not, the greatest win is becoming strong enough to choose yourself every time. The true transformation is not about making an avoidant person come back, but about finally coming back to yourself. When you stop chasing, you reclaim your peace, your worth, and your emotional stability. Your silence stops being empty and starts carrying strength, boundaries, and self-respect. And while they may begin to notice your absence, the real power lies in no longer needing them to. Because the moment you choose yourself fully is the moment everything within you and around you begins to change.